Hi, everyone. I'm Danielle Ballantyne, Managing Editor of Foreword Reviews, and this is another of our Petit Forewords, bite-sized interviews with indie authors. Today, we're sitting down with renowned evolutionary biologist Richard Dawkins to talk about his latest book, Flights of Fancy, Defying Gravity by Design and Evolution. So first of all, thank you for joining us today, Richard.
It's a pleasure, thank you.
So this book is about flight in all its forms. You have birds, of course, but also human flight, insect flight, even plant flight. It seems like a topic that might be intimidating in its scope. So how did that concept for the book come about?
I hope it's not intimidating. I have written an earlier book for young people called The Magic of Reality, which is about science. And it's got about 10 chapters in which each chapter begins with a question and then is answered in mythological terms to begin with, briefly. And then the correct scientific answers. Things like what is an earthquake? Why do we have winter and summer? Why do we have night and day? And I thought of maybe doing a second volume of that. And I thought maybe the first chapter would be on flight. So I started to write the chapter on flight and then realized that it was going to grow into a whole book. So that's the genesis of Flights of Fancy.
So as I'm sure most of our viewers here know, you are a legend in the field of evolutionary biology. You've been studying and writing in the field for decades. So I'm sure there's plenty for readers to get from Flights of Fancy. I, for one, never understood the full scale of aerial plankton and will now be scrubbing my contact lenses very vigorously. But I was wondering if there was anything new that you came across, despite all those years of study, something new and exciting for you to learn in your research for this book.
Gosh, well, you mentioned aerial plankton. I mean, I was sort of aware of it, but I didn't know all that much about it. And so I suppose I learned a bit there. That chapter amused me because my old professor, Alistair Hardy, who in Britain, professor means, or at least meant when I was an undergraduate, meant the head of department. So my old professor, Alistair Hardy, was sort of world authority on plankton in the sea. And I discovered when researching Flights of Fancy that he'd also done a very nice paper, I think in the 1930s, on aerial plankton. These are the little spiderlings and little insects and pollen and bacteria, microorganisms, which are floating around high up in the atmosphere. And they form a kind of aerial plankton. It's called aerial plankton. And he switched from studying plankton in the sea briefly to studying plankton in the air. And with a colleague, they rigged up a couple of kites, which they sent high up into the air. And between the kites was strung a net to catch aerial plankton, rather analogous to his continuous plankton recorder, which he deployed in the sea to analyze the plankton in the sea, rather more elaborate. And what I liked about it is they had an old car, a bullnose Morris, which they drove to the research site and then took off one tire and used the wheel as a winch for letting in and out the kites. So I thought that was a nice little story that's in the book, and there's a nice picture of old Alistair, dear old Alistair, with his bullnose Morris car, his 1920s bullnose Morris.
Well, I suppose that's proof right there. Necessity is the mother of invention. So
Yes,
if you had
indeed.
to narrow it down to one thing in this book that you hope readers take away from it, what would it be?
Well, the beauty of science, I suppose. I mean, science is everywhere in the book, both in the engineering and in the animal biology of flight. And maybe it comes to a climax in the last chapter, which is called The Outward Urge, which talks about flight and especially perhaps going out into space, which is the penultimate chapter, I think, as a metaphor for science itself. So the outward urge to explore, the urge that drove Christopher Columbus and Magellan and the Vikings who discovered America centuries before Christopher Columbus. And I like to think of that as a metaphor for science, which is a kind of mental equivalent of the outward urge that drove Columbus and the other explorers. So maybe that would be the take-home message. It is appropriately the last chapter.
And now this last question is really just for me. It has nothing to do with the book, but so long as we have you here, I have to ask, you coined perhaps not the concept, but the word meme, pulling from ancient Greek to form a term to describe self-replicating behaviors rather than genes. Obviously, it's drifted, it's evolved, so to speak, from your intended meaning. And I was just wondering, what has that been like for you to watch this evolution of your own creation in a way?
Well, its evolution has been a narrowing down and a reduction in its scope, and also a great reduction in its interest.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the idea of a self-replicating entity in the cultural domain as an analog of the gene in the biological domain is an interesting idea. As you said, it's not my idea; it's just my word. And the internet meme, which as far as I can tell is just a kind of cartoon, is a very boring minimization, a very boring cutting down. Or I mean, it is a meme in the sense that it spreads, and the internet is indeed a very fertile ecosystem for memes in the true sense of the word, as self-replicating entities in the cultural domain. And so an internet meme, a cartoon that people replicate, is a meme in that sense, but it's just a tiny example of a much broader concept.
It's just, I mean, you give the internet anything and they're going to run away with it, probably very, very far away with it. Just to close it out, is there any other projects that you're working on right now that you could share a little bit with us about?
Well, my next book I'm kind of halfway through, and it's called The Genetic Book of the Dead. And it's a kind of expansion. There's a chapter in my book, Unweaving the Rainbow, called The Genetic Book of the Dead, which is sort of gives the theme of it, which is that an animal is a description, or can be read. You can actually read an animal and its genes especially as a description of the ancestral worlds in which its ancestors lived, because natural selection shaped them. And you can kind of reverse engineer the animal's body and its genes to reconstruct the environments which did the selecting. It's a palimpsest, meaning a whole series of different scripts written on top of each other. But theoretically, I think a zoologist of the future should be able to read an animal, and say a hitherto unknown animal, read it and read out a description of ancestral worlds in which its ancestors lived. So that's The Genetic Book of the Dead. I think the title may be the best part. I think this is rather a good title, but we'll see if the book can live up to it.
It is a great title, and we're looking forward to that and whatever else you decide to turn your pen to next. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much indeed.